All right, just give me 1 second. Good. All right. All right, Shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahushai, Bahashem, Rachah Kodesh. Double honors to the apostles of Great Millstone, and peace and blessings to the elect. All right, just gonna, as a continuation. All right, um, the last video I did on this. All right, we left off in Daniel 11, verse 3. Okay, and today we're gonna go into verse 4, dealing with Alexander's generals. All right, going into the Diadochi, which was the name, all right, for Alexander's generals, and the different wars, into basically what happened in Daniel 11 and 4. What happened after Alexander's kingdom, after Alexander died. Okay, which is going to lead into the bulk, all right, of Daniel 11. So this is Daniel chapter 11 verse 4. Because usually when we mention Alexander, we know about the four generals, and we list them out, so on and so forth. But how did they become just four? Because when you look into it, it was more than just four generals that Alexander had. So what led up to that? What happened? And it's good to know the background of it, right? So it says, um, and when he shall, now going back to verse, I'll do a recap, right? Daniel 11 and 1. Also, I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, stood to confirm and to strengthen him. And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet three kings in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than they all. And we went over this. The three kings were Cambyses II, Bardia, and Darius. All right, the Persian, Darius the Great, they know him as. And the fourth shall be far richer than they all, which was Xerxes. Okay. And by his strength through his riches he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. And a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. Now this mighty king that shall stand up and would rule with great dominion was Alexander. All right, which I did a lesson on him, I believe, yesterday. So now verse 4 says, and when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up even for others beside those. So it didn't just happen overnight. All right. When Alexander died, there was a period in time, all right, where these things, it was like civil wars brewing here and there. Okay. So I'm gonna break it down. It says, and when he shall stand up, all right, when Alexander was in the peak of his kingdom, it says his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided towards the four winds of heaven. And that first started with what we have here, all right, known as the partition of Babylon. Okay. So it says, not to his posterity. All right, when you look up the word posterity, it says, let's go to the Hebrew here. Okay, let's go back. It says, end, issue, posterity, latter time. Let's look up the word in Google, posterity. All right, it says here, archaic meaning, the descendants of a person. All right, It says the Most High offered Abraham a posterity like the stars of heaven, meaning what? His offspring, his children. Okay, so when you go back to Daniel 11, when it says his kingdom shall be divided, all right, but not to his posterity, because as we're gonna read, Alexander, they when after he died, okay, his kingdom when it got split, we know about the generals, all right, but why don't we hear Alexander the Fourth being the king, and taking over and so on and so forth, because it didn't go to his children. All right, now it says nor according to his dominion which he ruled, because Alexander had a certain agenda, all right, when ruling. All right, he had a lot that he wanted to do. However, when he died, his generals basically did what they wanted to do. It says, "For his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those." And that's what we're about to get into real quick. Now, I want to start off with this here, First Maccabees chapter 1, because it also gives you sort of a recap, okay, of what we're about to go into. Now, this is First Maccabees 1:1. It says, "And it happened after that Alexander, the son of Philip, the Macedonian, who came out of the land of Kittim, had smitten Darius, king of the Persians and the Medes, that he reigned in his stead, the first over Greece, and made many wars, and won many strongholds, and slew the kings of the earth, and went through to the ends of the earth, and took spoils of many nations, in so much that the earth was quiet before him, whereupon he was exalted, and his heart was lifted up." All right, and that's when he was broken. When like it says, when he shall stand up. All right, Daniel 11:4, when he shall stand up. Okay, that was after he had basically conquered all these lands. It says, and he gathered a mighty strong host and ruled over many countries and nations and kings who became tributaries unto him. And after these things he fell sick and perceived that he should die. Wherefore he called his servants, such as were honorable, and had been brought up with him from his youth. Now remember, when yesterday we went over how Ptolemy, I believe it was Ptolemy and Cassander, were in the same school. They went to the same school as Alexander, so they were basically like childhood friends. All right. It says, had been brought up with him from his youth, and parted his kingdom among them while he was yet alive. So Alexander reigned 12 years and then died, and his servants bare rule every one in his place. And after his death, they all put crowns upon themselves, so did their sons after them many years, and evils were multiplied in the earth. All right. So now we're going to go to the partition of Babylon. All right, where it says, and this was the division of the Alexander's kingdom after he died. Now it says, the partition of Babylon was the first of the conferences and ensuing agreements that divided the territories of Alexander the Great. It was held at Babylon in June 323. Alexander's death at the age of 32 had left an empire that stretched from Greece all the way to India. All right, so as you can see here, all right, all the way from here, boom, to India. So this is a very vast empire. Okay. It says the issue of succession resulted from claims of the various supporters of Philip Aridaeus, which was Alexander's half-brother, and the as of then unborn child of Alexander and Roxana. Among others, the settlement saw Aridaeus and Alexander's child designated as joint kings, with Perdiccas serving as regent. All right. Now, Perdiccas, it says here, Perdiccas became a general in Alexander the Great's army and participated in Alexander's campaign against the Achaemenid Empire, which the Achaemenid Empire were the Persians, all right, or the Persians ruling over the Medes. So it says, following Alexander's death, he rose to become supreme commander of the imperial army and regent for Alexander's half-brother and intellectually disabled successor, Philip Aridaeus, because when a king dies and his heir is either incapable or too young to rule, they set up a regent. A regent is somebody that rules in the stead, all right, of the king. So if the rightful heir is too young, they would set up a regent who would be in control, doing what needs to be done, all right, while they tutor and bring up the child to where when the child, so he's basically ruling in the name or in the stead of the actual king. And this was the case when dealing with um Belshazzar. Okay, Belshazzar was a king regent ruling in the stead of his father Nabonidus. All right, going back to Babylon. So that's what Perdiccas was. He wasn't the actual king, but he had the authority of it because he was ruling in the stead, all right, here of Alexander's half brother. Because now Alexander's dead, they're looking for the next closest, legitimate heir to the throne. And Alexander has an unborn son and he has a half brother. So they said, all right, let's give it to the half brother Philip Aridaeus. But he's mentally disabled. So, they set up a regent. So it says, dealing with Perdiccas, he was the first of the Diadochi who fought for control over Alexander's empire. But in his attempts to establish a power base and stay in control of the empire, he managed to make enemies of key generals in the Macedonian army: Antipater, Craterus, and Antigonus Monophthalmus. Now, this guy Antigonus, all right, is very key. Okay, it says who decided to revolt against the regent. In response to this formidable coalition and a provocation from another general, Ptolemy, all right, Perdiccas invaded Egypt, but when the invasion foundered, his soldiers revolted and killed him. So that's how he died in mutiny. All right. So now going back to the partition of Babylon, Alexander's dead, and they have a meeting, and they're like, "Look, let's set up his half brother, okay, as the new king, and until his son is born, and then we can make them joint kings. But since his son is unborn and his half brother is mentally ill, let's set up a regent, and that regent was Perdiccas. So when you actually read more in depth, there was a period of time Perdiccas was running shit, doing this, that, and the third, and Edomite drama. So it says the territories of the empire became satrapies, and a satrapy is basically like a province, a piece of land, an area that's ruled over, by a governor or somebody. So it says divided between the senior officers of the Macedonian army and some local governors and rulers. The partition was solidified at the further agreements at Triparadisus, which is the next partition here. Okay, and Persepolis over the following years, and began the series of conflicts that compromised the wars of the Diadochi, and that's basically this means the wars of Alexander's generals or Alexander's successors, right? So when you look at this, all this at one point was controlled by Alexander, but Alexander is dead, so now it's split up amongst who? His generals. Okay. Now you notice here, these aren't just four generals. All right, they were these satrapies aren't controlled by just four people. Okay, because that's not how it started. Now you can see people you recognize. Lysa, what does that say here? Zoom in. Lysimachus. All right, which I believe this is the Greek way of saying it. So like we read it as Lysimachus, but in the Greek, that's how they had it. You had Antipatros, right? Now, when we list them out, we know Lysimachus, Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Cassander. But you don't see Cassander's name here. Why? Because Thrace and Macedon, Lysimachus having Thrace, Cassander would have Macedon, but Antipatros or Antipater was the father of Cassander. So he was actually in control of that land before, all right, later on, Cassander comes, and takes over. All right. So it says, so you have him, you recognize Lysimachus, you have recognize Ptolemaeus, all right, which is Ptolemy, all right. Who else? Antigonos, all right, which is Antigonus, all right, and a few others over here. Perdiccas, all right. Now notice is Philippos Aridaeus and Alexandros, and this is who we just read: Philip Aridaeus and Alexander. All right, Alexander the Fourth, and then Perdiccas. Okay, because we're reading about the partition of Babylon, and this is that area where Babylon is at. All right, and then you have a few others. All right, so all this was split up amongst those generals and governors. Like we read. All right, let's close this out. And that was the partition of Babylon. Now, as we read at the ending of this, they said it was solidified further at the partition of Triparadisus. So the partition of Babylon taking place fresh after the death of Alexander, all right, in 323 BC. Then they had another partition, which when you actually come down here, if you want to, know more, that's up to you. You can go into it. It shows you who had what. In Europe, how it was split. In Asia Minor, how it was split. Africa, how it was split, all the way on down. So you notice that this is not just four generals, right? There's a lot of people in here. Okay, different names, so on and so forth. But when we get to the ending of it, all right, the final four, is who we focus on. So next comes the partition of Triparadisus, and it says the partition of Triparadisus was a power sharing agreement passed at Triparadisus in 321. So this is about 2 years after the partition of Babylon. It says between the generals or the Diadochi of Alexander the Great, in which they named a new regent and arranged the reparation of the satrapies of Alexander's empire among themselves. It followed and modified the partition of Babylon made in 323 BC upon Alexander's death. So this is in Daniel 11, this is what's actually going on. All right, when Daniel mentions about how and when he shall stand up, Alexander, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided. All right, that is what we're reading about, the division, the partition. All right, apart when you part, these things, you're dividing them. Okay, that's where you get the word apart. Okay, so it says, and shall be divided towards the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, and that's what we're reading about right now. Okay, so because they tried to set up the kingdom through Alexander's posterity, however, that's not the case. It didn't go that way. All right, and that's the events we're reading right now. So it says, following the death of Alexander, the rule of his empire was given to his half brother Philip Aridaeus and Alexander's son Alexander IV. However, since Philip was mentally ill and Alexander IV born only after the death of his father, a regent was named in Perdiccas, as we read earlier. In the meantime, the former generals of Alexander were named satraps, all right? And the satrap is just like a governor, okay, of various regions of his empire. Several satraps were eager to gain more power, and when Ptolemy the First Soter, satrap, and Soter means savior, okay, and as we read on, you'll find out how he got that name. So you'll notice a lot of these individuals, we know them by their given names, right? Or like, their names that they got from doing certain traits, doing certain things, completing, certain tasks or whatever, right? So Ptolemy the First Soter, all right, they gave him that name Soter because of something he did, all right, like a throne name. It says satrap of Egypt rebelled with other generals. Perdiccas moved against the former, but was killed by a mutiny in his camp. So now what happens? Alexander's dead. His half brother, who's supposed to be set up, is mentally ill, and his newborn son clearly can't rule. So they set up a regent, all right, to rule in their stead, which is Perdiccas. But the generals under him rebel, and so now Perdiccas is dead, and now it's like a free for all. Okay, so it says Ptolemy declined the regency and instead brought to the office Paethon and Aridaeus. This designation met the strong opposition of Eurydice, wife of Philip III, leading in the meeting called in 321 at Triparadisus of all the generals to their replacement with Antipater. The meeting also proceeded to divide again the satrapies between the various generals. All right, Daniel 11 and 4, his kingdom was divided. All right, and as you can see here, Syria to Laomedon. All right, and you have Babylon to Seleucus. Okay, so this is the division of Alexander's kingdom to the different generals. But Seleucus eventually ends up getting more territory. Ptolemy gets more territory. Lysimachus gets more territory. So that's why we know them, as the main guys. Okay, but you see all these different generals in here, all these different, governors and so on and so forth. Yeah, they were all there. Okay, and now we lead up to the Diadochi, right? So it says the Diadochi, plural of Latin Diadochus from Greek, means successors. So when you hear like the war of the Diadochi, it just means the war of the successors. It says were the rival generals, families, and friends of Alexander the Great, who fought for control over his empire after his death in 323 BCE. The wars of the Diadochi marked the beginning of the Hellenistic period from the Mediterranean Sea to the Indus Valley. So boom, you see this right here. All right. This whole big old region here now after the wars, okay, gets solidified and belongs now to Seleucus. Okay, Seleucus gets this whole big ass region. Ptolemy gets this blue area. All right. This I believe Lysimachus gets this orange area, and Macedon and Greece is now run by Cassander. All right, which is the son of Antipater. Okay, so it says going into the wars of the Diadochi. All right, there were four major wars. We're not really going to go through all four. We're just going to focus on the fourth one because that's the most key. Okay, leading into further prophecies. So it says wars of the Diadochi. The wars of the Diadochi, or wars of Alexander's successors, were a series of conflicts fought between Alexander the Great's generals over the rule of his vast empire after his death. They occurred between 322 and 281 BC. So you see how long it took? But when you read it in Daniel 11 and 4, it's just one verse. All right. Now it's through these wars that you end up focusing now in verse 5 on the king of the south and the king of the north. So you got to know what happens through these wars and who becomes the king of the north and who becomes the king of the south and how does that go. So it says the wars of the Diadochi. Now, like I said, actually, let's see the background, right? So it says on June 10th, 323 BC, Alexander the Great died, leaving behind a huge empire stretching from Greece and Macedon in Europe to the Indus Valley in South Asia. All right, here's the map. All right, Greece and Macedon all the way to India. Okay, so it says his death left the Macedonians in a very difficult position. The ruthlessness of Philip and Alexander toward possible rivals, and Philip being his father, had left the empire without a clear and competent successor. Okay, so when Philip ruled and when Alexander ruled, they made sure that there wasn't any chance of people, usurping and so on and so forth. So now that they're dead, it's like shit. There's no real competitor to come and take over after them. So now it's in a state of very close to turmoil. So it says without a clear and competent successor, the Argead family was reduced. And when you go to the Argead family, it's basically a royal family. All right, like it says here, the Argead dynasty was an ancient Macedonian royal house of Dorian Greek provenance. They were the founders and ruling dynasty of the kingdom of Macedon from about 700 to 310 BC. So it says the Argead dynasty was reduced to Alexander's mentally defective half-brother Aridaeus, which we read about earlier, and his yet unborn son Alexander IV, and his reputed illegitimate son Heracles, a mere child, and the women of the family, his mother Olympias and his sister Cleopatra, and his half-sisters Thessalonice and Kynane or Cynane. It says, without a chosen successor, there was almost immediately a dispute among his generals as to whom his successor should be. Meleager, and that happens. Okay, it makes sense. It only makes sense that would happen. Everybody wants to become the ruler. It says, Meleager and the infantry supported the candidacy or the candidacy of Alexander's half-brother Aridaeus, while Perdiccas, the leading cavalry commander, supported waiting until the birth of Alexander's unborn child by Roxana. So you have two sides. One is saying, look, let's let his half-brother rule, let's let him become king. And you have another side saying, no, let's wait for his son to be born and have him become king. It says a compromise was arranged. Aridaeus, as Philip III, should become king and should rule jointly with Roxana's child, assuming that it was a boy, as it was becoming Alexander IV. So, all right, cool. You know what? Let's just have them both rule together. Perdiccas himself would become regent of the empire and Meleager his lieutenant. Soon, however, Perdiccas and Meleager, let's call him that, and the other infantry leaders murdered and assumed full control. So they said, you know what? We don't want, any other contributors to this, right? So let's just murk everybody. And since I'm the regent and you're my lieutenant, we just gonna run it. It says the other cavalry generals who had supported Perdiccas were rewarded in the partition of Babylon, which we read. So basically, you supported Perdiccas. He's the regent. He gives you a bigger portion to rule over. By becoming satraps of various parts of the empire, Ptolemy received Egypt, and then it's gonna list. It goes on to list on who received what and how did it go. Okay. Now we're gonna go down. After all this is set, what do you think is going to happen if you have all these different sat generals ruling different portions of land? Somebody's going to say, look, I don't want just this land. I want this one also. And then these guys go to war. He wins. This guy joins in. Oh, shit. Now I want this. Now this guy says I want this. And then you have people, these satraps or these generals fighting amongst each other for bigger territory. Civil war. All right. And that's exactly what happened. So you had the first war of the Diadochi or the Diadochi, and so on and so forth. And we want to focus on the fourth war, all right, which is from 308 to 301, because this is what sets up the setting for Daniel 11 and 5 going into the king of the south and so on and so forth, right? So it says the fourth war of the Diadochi, 308 to 301 BC, war soon broke out again. Ptolemy had been expanding his powers into the Aegean and to Cyprus, and the Aegean is right. Let me see. Let me pull it up. Yeah, I had to get this for my cover. It's hardcore though, it's hardcore. Aegean Sea map. All right. So as you can see right here, Aegean Sea is right here and leads into basically connected to the Mediterranean, right? So as we're reading, so as you can see, the Aegean Sea is right around here, connected to the Mediterranean, and Ptolemy has this territory here. He's getting Cyprus, he's getting Seleucia, Pierre, and Cilicia, and all these different areas down here. Okay, so reading on, it says while Seleucus went on a tour of the east to consolidate his control of the vast eastern territories of Alexander's empire. So Ptolemy is now expanding. He's taking this. He's taking here. He's taking this. Seleucus now says, all right, I'm going to go take all this over here. I'm going to go grab it all up. All right. Going back, it says Antigonus resumed the war, sending his son Demetrius to regain control of Greece. So now it comes down to five major generals. You have Ptolemy, you have Cassander, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Antigonus. All right. And Antigonus, all right, had the biggest portion. Okay. That's why they had to take his ass out. He was basically like a big bully. So let's look him up. Antigonus, they call him one-eyed. Okay. Map. Let's see. Let's see if it'll show us the territory he had, because he had a very large portion. Let's see. All right, so as you can see here, it shows us the kingdoms. and you see Ptolemy is in the yellow. And look at everything Antigonus got. Look at all this. Damn. So he got all this, and now he's causing problems. And they're like, yo, bro, you got the biggest land, and basically thinking that you could run shit because you got the biggest land. You basically thinking that you are the next king, right? So things had to be done, and as we're about to read, things were done. So it says, and Antigonus, having that big portion, his son Demetrius, they were working together. So it says Antigonus resumed the war, sending his son Demetrius to regain control of Greece. In 307, he took Athens, expelling Demetrius of Phaleron. This was in 307, Demetrius, the son of Antigonus, took over Athens and expelled Demetrius of Phaleron, different people. It says Cassander's governor. Cassander's governor and proclaiming the city free again. So Antigonus sends his son Demetrius up into Greece, Athens, and Cassander is the one in control over here. But he says, "Yo, go." He ousts Cassander's governor. He proclaims these people free, causing trouble over there. Okay, for Cassander. So it says Demetrius now turned his attention to Ptolemy. So now you don't go into Greece. Now you're like, shit, let me go up into, go mess with Ptolemy. Let me see what his territories are about. So it says, invading Cyprus and defeating Ptolemy's fleet at the Battle of Salamis. All right, showing you once again what it looks like. So Demetrius goes here, he goes to Athens, does what he does, bothers Cassander. Then he comes to Cyprus, all right, because remember, the blue, Ptolemy had this part. He comes here and defeats Ptolemy. Okay, remember, this is civil war. All right, this is civil war between Alexander's generals. All right. Everybody's trying to get a piece of land. People are fighting against each other, and it's going back and forth. Right? So it says, in the aftermath of this victory, Antigonus and Demetrius both assumed the crown, and they were shortly followed by Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and eventually Cassander. Right? And what did it say? They assumed what? The crown. Now let's go to First Maccabees and see what it says. It says here, where we at? So verse 7. So Alexander reigned 12 years and then died. Verse 8, and his servants bear rule, everyone in his place. Verse 9, and after his death, they all put what? Crowns upon themselves. Okay? They all put crowns upon themselves. What does it say here? Antigonus and Demetrius both assumed the crown, and they were shortly followed by who? Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and eventually Cassander. All right? So the scriptures are on point, accurate. Okay? Finish it real quick. It says, so did their sons after them many years, because it was like a dynasty, and evils were multiplied in the earth. And hell yeah, evils were multiplied in the earth. All right, so let's go back. It says, in 306, Antigonus attempted to invade Egypt. So he had that big ass portion of land, but now he wanted to come up in here and invade Egypt. Okay. And let's see what happened after that. It says, but storms prevented Demetrius's fleet from supplying him, and he was forced to return home. So his son is supposed to bring him aid, but the storms prevented that from happening, right? So it says, now with Cassander and Ptolemy both weakened, Seleucus still occupied in the east, Antigonus and Demetrius turned their attention to Rhodes, which was besieged by Demetrius's forces. In 305 BC, the island was reinforced by troops from Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Cassander. Ultimately, the Rhodians reached a compromise with Demetrius. They would support Antigonus and Demetrius against all enemies, save their great ally Ptolemy. Ptolemy took the title of Soter, meaning savior, for his role in preventing the fall of Rhodes. But the victory was ultimately Demetrius's, as it left him with a free hand to attack Cassander in Greece. So now you know how Ptolemy the first got his name Soter. All right. Upon saving Rhodes, he got that title Soter. So that's why we know him as Ptolemy the first Soter, meaning savior. All right. So it says, where were we at? Demetrius returned to Greece, defeated Cassander, and formed a new Hellenic league with himself as general to defend the Greek cities against all enemies, and particularly Cassander. In the face of these catastrophes, Cassander sued for peace, but Antigonus rejected the claims, and Demetrius invaded Thessaly, where he and Cassander battled in inconclusive engagements. But now Cassander called in aid from his allies, and Anatolia was invaded by Lysimachus, forcing Demetrius to leave Thessaly and send his armies to Asia Minor to assist his father. So now we're about to see that coalition that's formed against Antigonus, all right, which is going to lead to that full solidification of these four generals that you see right here having the different pieces of Alexander's empire. Okay, but they had to eliminate Antigonus out of the way. Okay, so it says here, but was soon in. Okay, it says here, da 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 da. With assistance from Cassander, Lysimachus overran much of western Anatolia, which is Turkey. All right, it's this area. Okay, the orange area. Um, It says, but was soon in 301 BC isolated by Antigonus and Demetrius near Ipsus. And remember that name because that's the final part we're going to read about, the Battle of Ipsus, where they eventually, take down Antigonus. It says, here came the decisive intervention from Seleucus, who arrived in time to save Lysimachus from disaster and utterly crush Antigonus at the Battle of Ipsus. Antigonus was killed in the fight, and Demetrius fled back to Greece to attempt to preserve the remnants of his rule. Lysimachus and Seleucus divided up Antigonus's Asian territories between them, with Lysimachus receiving Western Asia Minor, and Seleucus the rest, except Cilicia and Lycia, which went to Cassander's brother Pliastarchus. So now you see why this whole yellow area, all right, is in control of Seleucus has control over this whole big ass area because they ended up defeating Antigonus and they split it up. So now, all right, now we finally reached that final four, which is Seleucus, who has this yellow area, all right, Ptolemy, who has this blue area down here, Lysimachus, who has the orange area, and Cassander, who has this green area right here. So you have Thrace and parts of Western Asia Minor. You have Greece, Macedon. You have pretty much parts of Asia Minor going into the Mesopotamia, going into the east. All right, going down here, to where we were at. Okay, Jerusalem and all of that. All right, and then you have Ptolemy, which has Egypt, going up Gaza Strip, so on and so forth. All right, and then you have here the Battle of Ipsus was fought between some of the Diadochi in 301 BC near a town in Ipsus in Phrygia. Antigonus I, Monophthalmus, ruler of Phrygia, and his son Demetrius I of Macedon were pitted against the coalition of three other successors of Alexander: Cassander, ruler of Macedon; Lysimachus, ruler of Thrace; and Seleucus I Nicator, ruler of Babylonia and Persia. Only one of these leaders, Lysimachus, had actually been one of Alexander's somata flylakes, that is, bodyguards. So Daniel 11 and 4, now you know who's who, where it says, and when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken. All right, this is Alexander. He died. And shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven. Now you see how that division came about. It started off with the partition of Babylon, then the partition of Triparadisus, then it just led to war, and whoever came out at the end of the war was the one who had the territory that he had. So you notice how it went from all these different generals owning these different areas to now the four main generals owning the bulk, all right, of the empire. Okay, it says here, not according to and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. Because now we see that although they try to set up his son and his half brother, that's not who ended up ruling. And this was for prophecy's sake. For his kingdom shall be plucked up even for others beside those. And we just read that. Now, before I close, next time when we go into verse 5, you're going to see this area right here. When, as we keep going into the verses and it mentions the king of the north and the king of the south, what it's doing is it's focusing on those that are ruling up here and those that are ruling down here, because we are right here. So north of us are the Seleucids, all right, or the Antiochuses, and south of us are the Ptolemies. So when you read in Daniel 11, when it mentions the king of the north, it's dealing with those of the Seleucid dynasty or the Seleucid line. All right. Antiochus is in the Seleucid line. Okay. And when you read down here in the south, it's dealing with those of the Ptolemaic line. Okay. So it's going to tell you when the king of the south came and met with the king of the north and they did this, that, and the third, it's going into the Syrian wars because it was fought over Coel, Syria. Coel, Syria is just is saying call, all right, like how we say call in the Hebrew for all. That's what it means, all Syria. Coel Syria is Kal Syria, which is all Syria. So when we go into Daniel 11, 5, 6, 7, all the way on down, that's going into the wars between these people up here and these people down here, the Ptolemies against the Seleucids. All right. And it goes back and forth, and we got to basically bear the tragedies that happen in between, which eventually leads to Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes, who comes from the Seleucid line, comes from the king of the north, and then boom. So we're gonna get to all of that, but today we just wanted to cover Daniel 11 and 4, dealing with Alexander's generals. It's good to know who they are, but you also got to know how they came to be just these main four, because it didn't start with just four. Okay, it wasn't Alexander defeats the Persians and he gets the kingdom. He dies the next day, and then four generals rise up the day after that, and then boom. All right, there was a lot more to it. Okay, so I'm gonna basically close it out on that. Lord willing, this was edifying unto the elect. All right, just a little bit more background into it. All right, to give you that knowledge. As the Apostle says, in order to know the mystery or understand the mystery, you got to know the history. All right. So with that, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Rakah Kodash. Until next time, Shalom.